In the quiet residential enclave of Edgewood, Maryland, the home of 58-year-old Robert Richardson, Jr., appeared to be a model of suburban stability. Yet, behind the closed doors of this seemingly mundane household, a volatile conflict was brewing between a disciplinarian father and his defiant 16-year-old son, Robert Richardson III. The catalyst for the impending tragedy was shockingly trivial: a confiscated cell phone and a denied set of car keys. On January 9, 2012, that domestic friction escalated into a brutal act of parricide. Driven by an impulsive rage over his loss of privileges, the teenager retrieved a handgun and executed his father in cold blood, forever shattering the family unit. The violence left the boy's mother, Joyce Richardson, navigating an unthinkable nightmare. Caught in the emotional crossfire between the memory of the victim and the life of her child, she became a central figure in the tragic aftermath. This documentary examines the chilling disproportion between a teenager's desire to drive and his willingness to kill, leading to the devastating courtroom climax where the weight of evidence and familial testimony ensured Robert Richardson III would answer for his crime with a life sentence. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The sprawling suburban quiet of Blackjack, Missouri, in the northern reaches of St. Louis County, often belies the turbulence that can exist behind its closed doors. It is a place of manicured lawns, brick facades, and the comforting rhythmic hum of middle-class American life. In November of 2003, the residence of the Breening family stood as a testament to this suburban ideal, a sanctuary built by Robert and Mallory Breening. Robert, known to everyone as Bob, was a man characterized by a gentle fortitude, a distinct patience that served him well both in his professional life and within the complex dynamics of his home. Mallory, his wife, was the emotional anchor, a woman whose testimony would later become the linchpin in a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. However, to understand the trajectory of the shotgun blast that would eventually shatter the silence of their home, one must first dissect the intricate, suffocating atmosphere that had been building for years: a domestic pressure cooker fueled by mental illness, adolescent rebellion, and a fatal dispute over a set of car keys. The central figure in this unraveling narrative was not a stranger, but the couple's adopted son, Jamil Breening. Brought into the Breening fold with hopes of providing him a stable, loving environment, Jamil was a child who carried the heavy, invisible baggage of a troubled biology and a fragmented early history. Bob and Mallory were not naive parents. They were dedicated, compassionate individuals who believed that nurture could smooth out the jagged edges of nature. They invested their lives in Jamil, offering him the stability that the foster system so often fails to provide. Yet, as Jamil transitioned from a manageable child into a physically imposing adolescent, the chemistry of the household began to alter. The sweet boy they had taken in began to exhibit signs of severe psychological distress, eventually culminating in diagnoses that included bipolar disorder and manic depression. By the autumn of 2003, Jamil was 18 years old. Physically, he was an adult, possessing the strength and stature of a grown man. Psychologically, however, he was trapped in a volatile cycle of chemical imbalances. The clinical reality of bipolar disorder in an adolescent male is often a harrowing oscillation between crushing depressions and terrifying, grandiose manias. For the Breenings, this meant their home life was dictated by the mercurial moods of their son. There were periods of relative calm, windows of time where the medication did its work and the family could simulate normalcy. But these were becoming increasingly rare. The teenage years bring a natural desire for autonomy, a biological imperative to separate from one's parents. In Jamil's case, this natural drive was warped by his pathology. He chafed against rules not just with teenage angst, but with a pathological intensity that bordered on violence. The regimen of medication required to keep Jamil stable was significant. It acted as a chemical dam holding back a flood of aggression and erratic behavior. However, a common tragedy in the treatment of such disorders is the patient's refusal to comply. Jamil complained of how the drugs made him feel, sluggish, fogged, not himself. In the weeks leading up to the incident, the compliance had faltered. The dam was beginning to crack. Bob and Mallory found themselves walking on eggshells, hypervigilant to the tone of Jamil's voice, the dilation of his pupils, the sudden shifts in his demeanor. The house in Blackjack ceased to be a sanctuary and transformed into a zone of containment. Bob, ever the pragmatist, tried to enforce boundaries, believing that structure was the antidote to chaos. Mallory, while supportive of Bob, lived with the constant gnawing anxiety of a mother watching her child drift into darkness. The catalyst for the impending violence was mundane, a common point of contention in millions of American households. A car, specifically a silver Dodge Intrepid. To the outside observer, it was merely a mid-size sedan, a piece of machinery used for grocery runs and commutes. To Jamil Brining, the Dodge Intrepid was a totem of freedom. It represented an escape from the suffocating supervision of his parents, a vessel that allowed him to project an image of independence and status to his peers. He did not own the car. It belonged to Bob. But in Jamil's mind, possession was 9/10 of the law, and his entitlement to the vehicle had become an obsession. The vehicle became the focal point of the power struggle between father and son. Bob Brining viewed the car as a privilege, one that was contingent on good behavior, adherence to household rules, and, crucially, medication compliance. It was the one lever of influence Bob still held over a son who had physically outgrown discipline. If Jamil acted out, the keys were withheld. If Jamil refused his meds, the car stayed in the driveway. This dynamic created a friction that generated immense heat. Every denial of the keys was perceived by Jamil not as a consequence of his actions, but as a direct personal attack. The denial was a humiliation, a clipping of his wings. Throughout late October and early November, the atmosphere in the Brining home darkened. Jamil's behavior became increasingly erratic. The manic phases were characterized by agitation, rapid speech, and a short fuse. The depressive phases were sullen, silent, and brooding. The parents were trapped in a classic double bind. If they pushed too hard, Jamil might explode. If they didn't push at all, he would spiral out of control. They had engaged with mental health professionals. They had utilized the resources available to them. But the day-to-day management of a non-compliant 18-year-old male with a severe mood disorder falls squarely on the shoulders of the family. There are no nurses in the living room, no orderlies in the kitchen. It was just Bob, Mallory, and Jamil. The geography of the house played a role in the psychology of the conflict. The bedrooms, the hallway, the shared spaces. These were the arenas where the battles were fought. Jamil's room was his fortress, a place where he would retreat to seethe. The living room and kitchen were communal spaces that became minefields. Bob and Mallory's bedroom, usually a private retreat, would eventually become the setting of the nightmare. But in the days prior, It was simply the place where they whispered their fears to one another, trying to formulate a strategy to handle a son who was becoming a stranger. It is important to understand the specific weight of the dispute over the car keys. This was not a singular argument, but a repetitive, grinding conflict. Jamil would demand the keys. Bob would refuse, citing a litany of valid reasons: Jamil's erratic state, his lack of insurance, his previous reckless behavior. Jamil would escalate, using intimidation, shouting, and physical posturing. Bob would stand his ground, relying on his authority as the father and the owner of the vehicle. This cycle repeated itself with exhausting frequency. Each iteration stripped away a layer of Jamil's inhibition. The word no lost its meaning as a boundary and began to sound like a challenge. The neurological landscape of Jamil's brain during this period cannot be overstated. Without the stabilizing influence of his medication, his impulse control was severely compromised. The frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for reasoning and consequence analysis, was hijacked by the limbic system, the seat of emotion and rage. When Bob Brining refused the keys, Jamil didn't just hear a refusal, he felt an existential threat to his ego. The rage that followed was disproportionate, blinding, and dangerous. It is the nature of the pressure cooker dynamic. The pressure builds not from a single event, but from the inability of the steam to escape. There was no release valve for Jamil's frustration, and there was no retreat for Bob and Mallory. Complicating matters was the presence of a weapon in the home, a shotgun. In many Missouri households, the presence of a firearm is commonplace, a tool for sport or protection. In the context of the Brining home, however, it was a dormant hazard. Bob Brining, a responsible man, surely never imagined that the tool of defense would be turned against him. The gun represented the ultimate escalation, a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Its existence in the house added a layer of lethal potential to every argument. Even if it wasn't explicitly brandished, it sat in the background, a silent observer to the unraveling family dynamic. As the timeline crept toward the fatal day, the interactions between Jamil and his parents became transactional and terse. The warmth of the parent-child bond had been eroded by the constant friction of mental illness and behavioral management. Mallory Brining found herself in the role of mediator, trying to bridge the gap between her husband's rigid standards and her son's chaotic needs. She was the buffer, absorbing the shocks from both sides. Her testimony would later reveal the depth of her despair during this time, the feeling of watching a train wreck in slow motion and being powerless to stop it. She saw the glares Jamil shot at his father. She heard the mutterings under his breath. She felt the tension that vibrated through the floorboards. The issue of the car keys was symbolic of the transition of power. Bob was holding on to his role as the protector and provider, the head of the household who set the rules. Jamil was asserting his adulthood through brute force and intimidation. The Dodge Intrepid was the prize. To Jamil, obtaining those keys meant winning. It meant defeating his father. It meant asserting dominance. The fact that the car was merely a silver sedan is irrelevant. It could have been anything. It was the object of desire that Bob controlled and Jamil wanted. The keys were the scepter of power in the Brining kingdom, and Jamil was determined to seize them. There were warning signs, red flags that flapped violently in the wind of the approaching storm. Jamil's history included interactions with the juvenile justice system and mental health facilities. He was not unknown to authorities, but there exists a perilous gap in the system when a troubled youth turns 18. The legal leverage parents have evaporates. They cannot force hospitalization as easily. They cannot mandate medication. They are left with the moral obligation to care for their child, but without the legal tools to enforce compliance. Bob and Mallory were stranded in this gap. They couldn't kick him out. He was their son, and he was ill. They couldn't force him to take his pills. They were hostages in their own home, governed by the tyranny of their son's illness. The final days were marked by a Cold War. Silence was weaponized. Jamil would withdraw, refusing to engage, only to explode in sudden outbursts of verbal abuse. The topic always circled back to the car. He needed to go somewhere. He needed to see friends. He needed to be away from them. Bob's refusal was steadfast. He saw the state Jamil was in, the glazed eyes, the tremors of agitation, and knew that putting him behind the wheel of a 2-ton vehicle was negligent. Bob was protecting the public and protecting Jamil from himself. But protection feels like oppression to the irrational mind. On the day of the murder, the pressure cooker reached its critical limit. The mundane rituals of the morning were overshadowed by the looming confrontation. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. The specific details of that morning, the light coming through the windows, the breakfast dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, stand in stark contrast to the violence that was gestating in Jamil's mind. He had made a decision. The cycle of asking and being denied had become intolerable to him. The logic of his disease provided a terrifyingly simple solution. If the obstacle is removed, the object is obtained. Bob was the obstacle. The keys were the object. The psychological profile of Jamil at this juncture suggests a dissociation from reality. He was likely not seeing his father, the man who raised him, but rather an antagonist in his personal narrative. The dehumanization of the victim is a necessary precursor to murder. In Jamil's manic state, Bob Brining was reduced to a barrier. The emotional connections, the memories of childhood, the gratitude for adoption, the love of a father, were severed or suppressed by the chemical storm in his brain. The plan that formed was not one of complex premeditation in the legal sense of a contract killing, but the brutal, linear planning of a desperate and disordered mind. Mallory's presence in the home adds another layer of tragedy to the dynamic. She was the witness to the escalation. She saw the storm clouds gathering. Her interactions with Jamil that day were likely filled with the same desperate pleading that had characterized the previous weeks. Pleas to calm down, to take his medicine, to listen to his father. But words had lost their efficacy. Jamil was beyond the reach of maternal comfort or paternal discipline. He was operating on a frequency that only he could hear, driven by impulses that were alien to the loving environment he had been raised in. The layout of the bedroom where Bob was resting became the final stage. It was intended to be a place of rest, a private sanctuary. The intrusion of Jamil into that space was a violation of the highest order. It symbolized the total collapse of the family structure. The child entering the parents' room not to seek comfort, but to deliver death. The proximity of the shotgun, the accessibility of the ammunition, and the physical closeness of the family members created a trifecta of opportunity. As the narrative moves toward the fatal moment, it is crucial to remember that this was not a sudden, inexplicable snap. It was the culmination of years of struggle. It was the result of a system that struggled to manage severe adolescent mental illness. It was the result of a family trying to love a child who was incapable of receiving that love safely. The pressure cooker had been simmering for a decade. The heat had been turned up by the refusal of medication. The lid was clamped down by the denial of the car keys. And finally, the metal fatigued. The structural integrity of the Brining family failed. The tragedy of the Brining case lies not just in the act of murder, but in the preventability of it, juxtaposed with the inevitability of it. Looking back, the signs were there. The violence was foreshadowed in the punched walls, the screaming matches, the police visits. But in the moment, in the flow of daily life, Bob and Mallory were just parents trying to get through another day, hoping that tomorrow Jamil would be better, hoping that the phase would pass, hoping that the love they poured into him would eventually be enough to extinguish the rage. They didn't know that they were living on borrowed time, and that the currency of that time was the silver keys to a Dodge Intrepid. The background of the Brining family is a mosaic of good intentions and harsh biological realities. It is a story of adoption, of the hope that a stable home can fix a broken start. It is a clinical case study in the ravages of bipolar disorder. But mostly, it is the terrifying story of how a domestic dispute over a trivial object can metastasize into a capital crime when the mind of the aggressor has lost its tether to morality. The stage was set in blackjack. The players were in position. The motive, absurd to the rational mind, but absolute to the irrational one, was established. The pressure cooker was about to explode, and the testimony that would follow would reveal every crack and fissure in the vessel that was the Brining family. The timeline of November 14, 2020, in Fountain, Colorado, did not suggest an impending homicide. It was a Saturday evening in the quiet residential sprawl of El Paso County, where the Larkin household sat indistinguishable from its neighbors. Inside, however, the domestic architecture was fracturing under the weight of a trivial dispute that would soon culminate in irreversible violence. At the center of the residence, 19-year-old Anthony Larkin stood in direct confrontation with his father, 68-year-old Robert Larkin. The object of their contention was neither a substantial sum of money nor a matter of profound family honor. It was the set of keys to the family vehicle, a possession Robert had refused to relinquish to his son earlier that evening. The friction over the vehicle had been simmering for hours, a low-grade agitation that permeated the walls of the home. According to the timeline later reconstructed by investigators, the verbal altercations began in the late afternoon. Robert Larkin, a man described by neighbors as steady and disciplined, held firm on his decision. He judged Anthony's state of mind to be volatile and unstable, a perception that would be tragically validated before midnight. The refusal to hand over the keys acted as a psychological accelerant for Anthony, stripping away his inhibitions and narrowing his focus to a singular, deadly objective. At approximately 7 hours p.m., the verbal dispute escalated into physical posturing. Shelley Larkin, Anthony's mother and Robert's wife, was present in the home, witnessing the rapid disintegration of her family's safety. She would later provide the crucial testimony that detailed the metamorphosis of her son from a frustrated teenager into a calculated killer. The atmosphere in the room shifted from frustration to menace when Anthony produced a handgun. The introduction of the weapon did not immediately result in gunfire. Instead, it created a standoff, a frozen moment where the power dynamic in the household violently inverted. The ignition point occurred moments later. Anthony Larkin did not fire a warning shot. He did not brandish the weapon for mere intimidation. He discharged the firearm directly at his father. The first shot shattered the domestic quiet, followed rapidly by others. Robert Larkin fell where he stood, struck by multiple rounds that caused catastrophic internal damage. The clinical reality of the shooting was brutal. At close range, the caliber of the weapon inflicted wounds that rendered immediate aid largely futile. The suddenness of the violence left Shelley Larkin in a state of shock, yet she retained the presence of mind to navigate the chaos that ensued. The 911 call received by the Fountain Police Department Dispatch Center captured the raw terror of the aftermath. Shelley's voice, trembling and breathless, relayed the impossible reality. Her son had just shot her father. The dispatchers, trained to filter hysteria for tactical information, extracted the necessary details: location, status of the victim, status of the shooter. Shelley confirmed that Robert was down and unresponsive. More critically, she relayed that Anthony was still on the premises, or at least had not been confirmed to have left the immediate vicinity. The call upgraded the response to a high-priority, active shooter situation, triggering a rapid deployment of law enforcement to the Larkin residence. Patrol units arrived at the scene with sirens cut, utilizing a tactical approach to avoid drawing fire. The suburban street was bathed in the harsh red and blue strobe of emergency lights, casting long, dancing shadows against the facades of the houses. Officers established a perimeter, their weapons drawn, unsure if Anthony Larkin was barricaded inside or if he had fled into the surrounding neighborhood. The air was cold, the silence of the night punctured only by the crackle of police radios. Upon entering the residence, officers were met with the metallic scent of spent gunpowder and the visual evidence of the homicide. Robert Larkin lay on the floor, his body motionless. Paramedics, escorted by armed officers, approached the victim to check for vital signs. The assessment was rapid and clinical. Pupils fixed and dilated, no pulse, agonal breathing absent. Robert Larkin was pronounced dead at the scene. The transition from a rescue operation to a homicide investigation was immediate. The house was locked down, yellow tape unspooling to cordon off the property, transforming the family home into a sterile crime scene. Detectives from the Fountain Police Department and the El Paso County Sheriff's Office arrived to assume command of the investigation. The initial sweep of the house revealed the shell casings scattered across the floor, brass markers of the violence that had transpired. Each casing was marked with a numbered evidence tent, creating a geometric map of the shooting. Forensics experts began the meticulous process of documentation, photographing the body, the blood spatter patterns, and the position of the casings relative to the victim. The trajectory analysis would later confirm that Robert was shot from a standing position and potentially while he was falling, indicating a sustained intent to kill rather than a singular, accidental discharge. The search for Anthony Larkin became the primary operational objective. Information relayed by Shelley indicated he had fled the immediate room, but his whereabouts were unknown. A manhunt was initiated, with officers canvassing the neighborhood and K-9 units deployed to track his scent. The danger to the public was deemed critical. An armed suspect who had just executed his father was loose in the community. However, the manhunt was short-lived. Anthony was located not far from the scene, the adrenaline of the act having seemingly dissipated into a fugue state. The arrest was effected without a secondary firefight. Anthony Larkin was taken into custody, his demeanor described by arresting officers as detached, almost surreal in its calmness. He was transported to the Fountain Police Department for processing, while technicians bagged his hands to preserve potential gunshot residue. Microscopic particles of lead, barium, and antimony that would physically link him to the discharge of the firearm. His clothing was seized, sealed in paper bags to prevent the degradation of biological evidence, specifically the high-velocity blood spatter that often coats a shooter at close range. Back at the residence, the forensic processing continued through the night. The layout of the scene told a clear story of the argument over the keys. The keys themselves were located, a mundane object now imbued with horrific significance. Investigators noted their location relative to Robert's body, documenting whether they had been dropped, thrown, or remained in a pocket. This detail was vital for the prosecution. It would corroborate Shelley's account that the denial of the vehicle was the sole precipitating factor. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a third party. The violence was entirely contained within the family unit. Shelley Larkin, though traumatized, provided a statement that would become the cornerstone of the case. In the sterile environment of the interview room, she recounted the evening with painful clarity. She described Robert's firmness, his protective instinct in denying Anthony the car, and the sudden, incomprehensible escalation. She detailed the look in her son's eyes, a vacuous stare that preceded the gunfire. Her testimony stripped away any potential defense of self-protection on Anthony's part. There was no physical threat from Robert, no weapon in the father's hand. There was only a father saying no, and a son responding with lethal force. The autopsy of Robert Larkin was conducted by the El Paso County Coroner's Office the following day. The medical examiner's report was a catalogue of devastation. It documented the entry wounds, tracing the path of the bullets through soft tissue and vital organs. The report noted the absence of defensive wounds on Robert's hands, suggesting he did not have time to raise his arms to shield himself or struggle for the gun. He was executed before he could process the lethal intent of his son. The toxicology report for Robert was clean, further dismantling any narrative that the father was intoxicated or belligerent. He was sober, lucid, and murdered in his own living room. As the investigation deepened, detectives delved into Anthony Larkin's background. They seized his electronic devices, looking for digital footprints that might suggest premeditation or a history of violent ideation. Text messages and search histories were scrutinized. While the murder appeared impulsive, triggered by the denial of the keys, investigators looked for patterns of conflict. They found a history of tension, a strained relationship that had been eroding for months. The car keys were merely the final stressor that snapped the tension. The interrogation of Anthony Larkin offered a glimpse into his psyche. He did not present the chaotic, weeping demeanor of a child who had accidentally harmed a parent. Instead, his responses were often flat. He acknowledged the dispute. He acknowledged the desire for the vehicle. The disconnect between the triviality of the motive and the finality of the action was jarring even to seasoned homicide detectives. He spoke of the keys as if they were a rightful possession that had been unjustly withheld, framing the murder as a transactional consequence of that withholding. This lack of remorse, this clinical justification, would later weigh heavily during sentencing. The forensic ballistics report returned a match. The bullets recovered from Robert Larkin's body were fired from the handgun recovered by police. The striations on the projectiles matched the unique rifling of the barrel, a mechanical fingerprint that allowed for 100% certainty. Gunshot residue tests on Anthony's hands came back positive. The physical evidence was overwhelming, forming an ironclad enclosure around the defendant. There were no gaps in the chain of custody, no ambiguities in the crime scene reconstruction. The role of the mother, Shelley, cannot be overstated in the investigative phase. In many parricide cases, the surviving parent is often reluctant to cooperate, torn between the loss of a spouse and the potential loss of a child to the justice system. Shelley Larkin, however, chose the path of absolute truth. She walked investigators through the physical blocking of the scene, where Robert stood, where Anthony stood, where she was positioned. She corrected timelines, clarified the nature of the verbal exchange, and provided the emotional context that physical evidence alone could not convey. Her cooperation ensured that the narrative of the night remained focused on Robert as the victim of an unprovoked assault. During the pre-trial phase, the defense attempted to navigate the overwhelming evidence by focusing on Anthony's mental state. They sought to portray the incident as a break from reality, a moment of temporary insanity brought on by underlying psychological issues. However, the investigative files compiled by the Fountain Police Department painted a different picture. They showed a sequence of logical, albeit horrific, decisions. Anthony wanted the keys. He was denied. He retrieved a weapon. He aimed. He fired. He fled. These were the actions of a person capable of cause and effect reasoning, not someone in the throes of a psychotic break that rendered them unable to understand the nature of their actions. The culmination of the investigation led to the courtroom, where the sterile facts gathered on that November night were presented to a jury. The prosecution laid out the timeline: the argument at 7:01 p.m., the shooting, the 911 call. They displayed the crime scene photos, the autopsy diagrams, and the weapon. But the pivot point of the trial was Shelley Larkin. When she took the stand, the courtroom logic shifted from forensic to human. She was the voice of the victim, her husband, and the accuser of the perpetrator, her son. Her testimony did not waver. She recounted the banality of the argument over the car keys, emphasizing how such a small thing became the justification for murder. She described the sound of the gunshots, a memory that had clearly etched itself into her permanent consciousness. The jury was presented with the reality of a life extinguished for the sake of a drive. The prosecution argued that to allow any leniency would be to validate the idea that lethal violence is an acceptable response to parental discipline. They utilized the forensic evidence to show the efficiency of the killing. Robert didn't suffer a single accidental wound. He was put down. The intent was clear. Anthony Larkin was found guilty of first-degree murder. The mandatory sentencing guidelines, bolstered by the aggravating factors and the sheer senselessness of the crime, left little room for negotiation. The judge, taking into account the testimony of the mother and the brutal evidence presented by the state, handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chance, no opportunity for Anthony to drive the car he had killed for. The investigation into the death of Robert Larkin stands as a case study in domestic homicide investigation. It highlights the speed at which a household can destabilize. From the perspective of law enforcement, it was a clean case. Suspect in custody, weapon recovered, witness present. But the clinical precision of the police work, the bagging of hands, the trajectory rods, the DNA swabs, served to underscore the tragedy. Every piece of evidence collected was a testament to a father's failed attempt to set a boundary for his son. The house in Fountain, Colorado, eventually returned to silence, but the echoes of that night remained in the case files. The 911 call recording remains archived, a digital tape of the moment Shelley Larkin realized her life was bisected into before and after. The car keys, once a mundane item on a kitchen counter, remain logged in an evidence locker, a heavy, rusting symbol of the exchange rate Anthony Larkin applied to his father's life. As the heavy steel doors of the correctional facility closed behind Anthony Larkin, the finality of the legal process mirrored the finality of the murder. The system had worked exactly as designed. The police had investigated, the science had corroborated, and the witness had testified. But the resolution of the case offered no restoration. Robert Larkin was still dead, and his son was effectively erased from society, a living ghost in the penitentiary system. The ignition point had been a refusal of keys. The destination was a concrete cell. The narrative of the Larkin murder is devoid of mystery, but heavy with warning. It strips bare the fragility of family dynamics when mental instability meets firearm accessibility. The detectives who worked the case often cite it, not for its complexity, but for its clarity. There was no whodunit. There was only the why. And the answer to that question, car keys, was the most haunting element of all. It was a motive so disproportionate to the crime that it rendered the violence almost incomprehensible, leaving investigators to catalogue the physical facts of a tragedy that defied emotional logic. In the end, the testimony of Shelley Larkin did more than just secure a conviction. It preserved the truth of Robert Larkin's final moments. It ensured that he was not remembered as a man involved in a mutual combat, but as a father standing his ground, killed by the very life he had helped create. The investigation, precise and unyielding, honored that truth by converting the chaos of the crime scene into the order of a verdict, locking away the son who valued a drive more than his father's heartbeat. The courtroom of the Oakland County Circuit Court was heavy with a silence that felt less like order and more like suffocation. It was June of 2012, and the air was thick with the anticipation of a reckoning for a crime that had shattered the suburban tranquility of Farmington Hills, Michigan. The focus of the room was not just on the defendants, 19-year-old Tucker Cipriano and his 20-year-old friend Mitchell Young, but on the victims who were absent and the one who had miraculously, agonizingly appeared. The prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecutor John Skoczynski, had constructed a case that detailed a level of brutality that defied the comprehension of the jury. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of an argument. It was a siege. The evidence laid out during the proceedings painted a timeline of the early morning hours of April 16, 2012, characterized by a drug-fueled desperation for synthetic marijuana known as K2 or spice. The motive, clinically dissected by the state, was trivial compared to the carnage it wrought: a debit card and a set of car keys. Tucker Cipriano, a young man whose history of substance abuse and probation violations had escalated into the ultimate act of patricide, sat at the defense table. The narrative established by the investigators revealed that Tucker and Young had broken into the Cipriano home, not once, but multiple times that night. The friction point, the catalyst for the violence, was the refusal of the family to fund Tucker's addiction. The prosecution detailed how Tucker had been banished from the home weeks prior, yet returned with a sense of entitlement that turned lethal. The primary objective was the keys to the family vehicle, a means to liquidate stolen goods and acquire more drugs. The forensic testimony was harrowing. Dr. Ljubisa Dragovic, the Oakland County medical examiner, took the stand to describe the injuries sustained by 52-year-old Robert Cipriano. Bob, as he was known to his community, had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The clinical precision of the autopsy report catalogued blunt force trauma so severe it had caused catastrophic skull fractures. The defense for Mitchell Young attempted to minimize his role, painting Tucker as the mastermind and Young as a reluctant participant. But the physical evidence, blood spatter patterns and DNA, placed both men at the epicenter of the violence. However, the legal proceedings transcended standard criminal litigation when the court addressed the survivors. The attack had not only claimed the life of Robert Cipriano, but had left his wife, Rose, and their 17-year-old son, Salvatore, in critical condition. Salvatore remained hospitalized with severe brain injuries, unable to speak for himself. But Rose Cipriano, defying medical expectations, had survived. The courtroom atmosphere shifted perceptibly when the extent of Rose's injuries was detailed. She had suffered severe head trauma that required emergency surgery and extensive rehabilitation. The betrayal was absolute. The woman who had given Tucker life and who had spent years trying to navigate his behavioral spirals had been bludgeoned by the intruders he led into their sanctuary. The prosecution highlighted that the violence unleashed upon Rose was not collateral damage, but a deliberate attempt to eliminate a witness to the theft of the car keys and banking cards. The turning point of the legal saga came with the plea hearing. In a move that surprised the gallery, Tucker Cipriano chose to plead no contest to first-degree felony murder. This was a procedural mechanism that functioned as a guilty plea, ensuring a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. His attorney, Mitchell Ribitwa, indicated that Tucker wished to spare his family, particularly his sister Isabella, who had hidden in a closet and called 911 during the attacks, the trauma of a full trial. This left Mitchell Young to stand trial alone. It was during this phase that the full weight of the ultimate betrayal was elucidated. The testimony of Isabella Cipriano, delivered with a bravery that belied her youth, recounted the sounds of the attack. The audio of her 911 call was played, a recording that captured the visceral terror of a child listening to her family being destroyed. She identified her brother's voice, a damning piece of evidence that linked the conspiracy directly to the execution of the violence. But the most searing moments came during the sentencing hearing on July 24, 2012. Judge Shalina Kumar presided over a courtroom packed with emotional observers. The focus turned to Rose Cipriano. Though she did not take the stand to testify against her son in a traditional adversarial sense, having been spared that by his plea, her presence and her prepared statement, read by her attorney due to her physical frailty, were the defining testimony of the case's impact. Rose's words were not of vengeance, but of a shattered heart. The statement revealed the duality of her existence, the grieving widow and the mother of a murderer. She expressed a devastating love for Tucker, even as she acknowledged the horrific reality of his actions. She spoke of Bob Cipriano not just as a victim, but as a devoted father who had spent his final moments trying to protect his family. The clinical reality of the court record merged with the raw human tragedy when Rose's statement addressed the destruction of their family unit, Sal's debilitating injuries, the psychological scars on Isabella and her other brother Tanner, and the void left by Bob. The juxtaposition of the motive, car keys and drug money, against the outcome was stark. Prosecutor Skrasinski did not mince words during the sentencing. He characterized the crime as utterly senseless, noting that the defendants had extinguished a pillar of the community and destroyed a family for items of negligible value. He argued that the depravity exhibited by both men warranted the maximum penalty allowed by Michigan law. When Tucker Cipriano was given the opportunity to speak, the courtroom fell silent. Shackled and clad in jail greens, he struggled through tears to articulate an apology. He addressed his mother directly, his voice cracking as he expressed a regret that felt woefully inadequate against the backdrop of the devastation he had caused. He claimed he never intended for his father to die, a statement that stood in sharp contrast to the medical examiner's report detailing the ferocity of the blows delivered to Robert Cipriano's head. Judge Kumar was unmoved by the tears. Her sentencing remarks were precise and cutting. She acknowledged the tragedy but focused on the absolute finality of the crime. She noted that while Tucker's drug addiction was a factor, it was not an excuse for the calculated decision to break into the home, arm himself with a bat, and bludgeon his parents. She highlighted the betrayal of the parent-child bond, stating that the home should be the one place of safety, a safety Tucker had violently dismantled. For Mitchell Young, who had maintained his innocence and claimed he was forced to participate, the judge was equally scathing. The jury had deliberated for only a few hours before convicting him of first-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, and armed robbery. Judge Kumar described him as a willing participant in the carnage, dismissing his narrative of coercion. The sentences were handed down with the finality of a gavel strike. For the murder of Robert Cipriano, Tucker Cipriano was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For the assaults on Rose and Salvatore, he received concurrent sentences of years that were effectively academic. He would die in a Michigan correctional facility. Mitchell Young received the exact same sentence, life without parole. As the deputies prepared to escort the men out of the courtroom, the camera lingered on the survivors. Rose Cipriano, supported by family, sat as a living testament to the violence. She had survived the bat, but the testimony of her injuries, the visible scars and the empty seat, where her husband should have been, ensured that the gravity of the crime was etched into the public record. The narrative of the Cipriano murder remains a harrowing case study in the intersection of substance abuse and patricide. The car keys, the object of desire that night, were never used to drive away to freedom. Instead, they became the artifacts of a tragedy, trivial items for which a father was murdered, a brother was maimed, and a son was condemned to a concrete box for the remainder of his natural life. The ultimate betrayal was not just the theft, or even the violence. It was the annihilation of the family bond, severed permanently by a son who valued a synthetic high over his father's life. The heavy steel doors of the Missouri Department of Corrections do not care about the triviality of a motive. When they slam shut behind Robert Garth Jr. in the autumn of 1999, they finalized a transaction that had begun with a demand for the keys to a Ford Expedition and ended with a life sentence. The verdict of first-degree murder and armed criminal action, delivered by a St. Louis jury, was not merely a legal conclusion, but the beginning of a long, static existence for a young man who had traded his future for a vehicle he would never drive again. As Robert was processed into the system, exchanging his civilian identity for an inmate number, the reality of life without the possibility of parole began to settle in the concrete silence of his cell. He was 17 years old when he pulled the trigger, barely on the cusp of adulthood, yet the judicial system had deemed him irredeemable. For Denise Garth, the mother who'd provided the testimony that sealed her son's fate, the aftermath was a different kind of imprisonment. The silence in the Garth home was absolute. Every room held the memory of the violence that occurred on June 6, 1998. The kitchen where Robert Garth Sr. had been sitting, eating a meal when his son shot him in the face, was no longer a place of family gathering, but a crime scene scrubbed clean of blood, yet stained by memory. Denise had to reconcile two impossible realities: the grief of a widow and the guilt of a mother who had assisted in her child's condemnation. Her testimony had been clinical, necessary, and devastating. She had recounted the arguments, the entitlement, and the horrific climax of that day, stripping away any defense her son might have fabricated. In doing so, She protected the legacy of her husband, but severed the biological cord to her son, leaving a void where a family used to be. As the years turned into decades, the Ford expedition, the catalyst for the patricide, became an obsolete relic of the late 90s. The object of desire that had sparked a lethal rage rusted away in scrapyards or was crushed into a cube of metal, its value depreciating to nothingness. Meanwhile, Robert Garth Jr., aged within the stasis of the prison system, the boy who killed for a set of keys grew into a middle-aged man who had never paid a utility bill, never held a job, and never navigated the complexities of the adult world he had been so desperate to enter on his own terms. His life became a routine of counts, lockdowns, and the monotonous passage of time, a stark contrast to the freedom he had envisioned when he demanded the car. The psychological toll of knowing that his incarceration was the direct result of his mother's truth-telling added a layer of complexity to his sentence. He was not just a prisoner of the state. He was an exile from his own bloodline. The legal landscape regarding juvenile offenders began to shift in 2012, with the United States Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which held that mandatory life sentences without parole for those under 18 were unconstitutional. This ruling sent a tremor through the Missouri legal system and offered a faint glimmer of hope to inmates like Robert Garth Jr. The retroactive application of this ruling meant that Robert, having been 17 at the time of the murder, was theoretically eligible for resentencing or a parole hearing. The possibility of release reopened old wounds for the surviving family members. The judicial system was forced to re-examine the case not through the lens of the 1998 trial, but through the modern understanding of adolescent brain development. However, the brutality of the crime remained a stubborn, immovable fact. This was not a robbery gone wrong or an accidental discharge during a struggle. It was an execution of a father by his son over a material possession. During the review processes that followed the legislative changes in Missouri, the specifics of the Garth case were scrutinized with clinical precision. The prosecutors and parole boards looked at the premeditation involved. They reviewed the evidence that Robert Jr. had acquired the .380 caliber handgun specifically to confront his father. They revisited the testimony that described Robert Jr. stepping over his dying father to retrieve the keys from his pocket before fleeing the scene. These were not the impulsive actions of a confused child, the state argued, but the cold calculations of a sociopathic personality. The argument for leniency based on age clashed violently with the visceral reality of the crime scene photos. For Denise, the potential of her son's release brought a renewed wave of trauma. The woman, who had found the strength to testify in 1999, was now older, carrying the weight of 20 years of loss, facing the prospect of encountering the man who had destroyed her life on the streets of St. Louis. The legacy of the Garth family murder is a testament to the destructive power of entitlement and rage. In the rearview mirror of history, the murder serves as a grim milestone in the discussion of juvenile justice and patricide. Robert Garth Jr.'s life in prison is a sterile existence, devoid of the milestones that mark a normal life, marriage, career, children. Instead, his legacy is defined by case numbers and legal briefs. The ashes of the family bond were scattered the moment the gun went off, and no amount of time served can reconstitute them. The father, Robert Sr., remains frozen in time, a victim of his son's lethal tantrum. The mother, Denise, remains a survivor of a dual tragedy, having lost her husband to murder and her son to the penal system. As Robert Garth Jr. continues to serve his time, the world outside the prison walls has evolved, leaving him behind. The technology, the culture, and the very city of St. Louis have changed, rendering him a ghost in his own timeline. The car keys that he killed for are long gone. The ignition they fit no longer exists, and the destination he sought to reach is forever out of range. The narrative of the Garth family ends not with redemption, but with the cold, hard endurance of consequences. The vivid description of the crime, a son standing over his father, the metallic smell of gunshot residue, the snatching of the keys, remains the defining image of his existence. It is a loop that plays perpetually in the minds of those who remember, a stark reminder that some bridges, once burned, can never be crossed again, and that the price of a moment's rage is often paid in the currency of a lifetime. In the quiet aftermath of the verdict, the Cannon household remains a monument to a fracture that can never heal. The murder of James Cannon was not born of long-standing abuse or a calculated financial plot, but of a momentary petulant fury over the keys to a vehicle. It is a chilling testament to the volatility of the adolescent mind, where a denial of access is perceived as an existential threat. Robert Cannon sought the ultimate teenage symbol of autonomy. In seizing it through the barrel of a gun, he ensured he would never possess autonomy again. The keys represented a drive to a friend's house. The sentence represents a permanent residency in a concrete cell. There is a perverse symmetry in his fate, as by demanding absolute freedom at the cost of his father's life, he forfeited his own right to ever walk free again. For Shirley Cannon, the tragedy is twofold and absolute. She occupies the singular hellish position of being both the grieving widow and the damning witness. Her testimony was not an act of betrayal, but a surrender to the objective truth of what her son had become in those fatal seconds. She is left to navigate a home that echoes with the absence of her husband, while carrying the heavy knowledge that her voice helped seal the tomb of her son's future. The limits of parental love were tested not by her inability to forgive, but by the necessity of justice for James. The car keys, trivial pieces of cut metal, are stripped of all value when weighed against the total destruction they catalyzed. This case serves as a bleak dissection of familial fragility, proving that the line between a domestic dispute and a homicide is sometimes as thin as a trigger pull. Robert remains behind bars, frozen in the consequences of a singular tantrum, while Shirley survives in the void he created, bound by a silence that no verdict can truly resolve.